Out of 6 marks, in part A, 1 question they will ask, in part B, 1 question, as well as in part C, 1 question. Up to data file handling is a practical oriented concept, whereas when they come on database concept, it's entirely theory oriented concept. If you create tables or any other program without using forms, on that case, in the output screen, we cannot able to edit any values. Welcome to one and all. I am Vasanta, lecturer in Computer Science, Vidhyaashram, Temple of Excellence, Mysuru. Today, we will start with the introduction part of second PU syllabus. Whereas on this session, you will come to know which are the major chapters you have, what is the weightage of that chapter, how to write the exam, and what is the marks on each and every chapter. Regarding that, you will come to know. Whereas this is a textbook you have to follow in second PU. Whereas when they come on the syllabus, you have totally 17 chapters. The first chapter, typical configuration of computer system, Boolean algebra, logic gates, data structure, review of C++, Hoops concept, classes and object, function overloading, then inheritance, pointers, data file handling, database concept, SQL commands, networking concept, internet and open source concept, as well as web designing. These are the few chapters you have to study in second PUC. When you come on the weightage of each and every chapter, in the first chapter, that is typical configuration of computer system, here the total weightage of this chapter is 6 marks. Out of 6 marks, in part A, 1 question they will ask, in part B, 1 question, as well as in part C, 1 question. That is, in part A, usually 1 marks, in part B, 2 marks, in part C, 3 marks. If you have a question in part D, then it will be 5 marks. Whereas here, 1 marks, 2 marks, as well as here 3 marks. Totally 6 marks you will get in the annual exam. Whereas on this chapter, you will study regarding what do you mean by motherboard, the components of motherboard, and how exactly it is working, different types of slots, ports, how power supply will be performed there, how power will be supplied to each and every component of the computer. Regarding that, you will come to know on this chapter. Whereas in the second chapter, you have Boolean algebra. The total weightage of this chapter is 9 marks in the annual exam. Out of 9 marks, in part A, they will ask 2 questions, in part B, 1 question, as well as in part D, 1 question. That is 5 marks, 1 question, 2 marks, 1 question, as well as 1 marks, 2 questions they will ask. The total weightage is 9 marks. Whereas on this chapter, you will come to know regarding the kernel map, that is K-map, with that all the postulates, how to prove that by using perfect induction method as well as algebraic method. All those things you will study on this Boolean algebra chapter. And here it is number oriented chapter. Especially here in part D, usually they will ask the questions on K-map. Usually they will ask the question K-map, otherwise postulate. Regarding this, they will ask the question in part D. The third chapter is logic gate. The total weightage of this chapter is 6 marks in the annual exam. Out of that, in part A, 1 question they will ask, in part B, 1 question, as well as in part C, 1 question. Totally 6 marks weightage. Whereas on this chapter, you will study regarding what do you mean by gates, which are the basic gates, which are the derived gates, how to write the circuit diagram, as well as truth table for all the basic gates as well as derived gate. This is very easiest chapter in your syllabus. The fourth chapter is data structure. On this chapter, you will study regarding the data structure. The total weightage of this chapter is 19 marks. This chapter having highest weightage. Whereas on this chapter, in part A, 1 question they will ask, in part C, 1 question, as well as in part D, they will ask 3 questions. Whereas on this chapter, you will come to know what do you mean by data, what do you mean by data structure, what do you mean by arrays, stack, queue, how exactly it is working. Regarding that, you will come to know. Whereas on this chapter, they will ask the majorly in part D, algorithms they will ask, or the operations of arrays, stack, queue, like that they will ask. Major on this chapter you will study regarding arrays, on that which are the operations you have, stacks as well as queues. Regarding this you will come to know on this chapter. Whereas the next chapter, that is review of C++. In this review of C++, in the annual exam, they will not going to ask any single question from this chapter. But in this chapter, you will come to know only the basic things of C++ programming. How to write the programming, then how to use while loop, do while loop, for loop, all those things you will come to know in this chapter. Whereas the sixth chapter is hoops concept. The total weightage of this chapter is totally 6 marks in the annual exam. Totally 6 marks they will ask. Whereas in part A, 1 question, as well as in part D, 1 question. Totally 6 marks you will get. Whereas on this chapter, you will study regarding the features. Regarding the features of hoops like class, object, inheritance, data file handling. Regarding that, you will come to know, as well as advantages, disadvantages, as well as applications. These are the major thing you will study on this chapter. Only the features, advantage, disadvantages, as well as application. Whereas the seventh chapter is classes and object. On this chapter, you have total weightage is 7 marks in the annual exam. Out of 7 marks in part A, they will ask 2 questions, as well as in part D, 1 question. That is for 5 marks 1 question, as well as 1 marks 2 questions they will ask. Whereas on this chapter, you will come to know regarding what do you mean by class, how to create a class, the syntax of class, inside the class, outside the class, object of a class, how to use this in the program. Regarding that, you will come to know. Whereas the 8th chapter is function overloading. Whereas in this function overloading, the total weightage is 7 marks in the annual exam. Out of 7 marks, in part B, they will ask 1 question, as well as in part D, they will ask 1 question. That is totally 7 marks weightage. Whereas on this chapter, you will study regarding the function overloading. What do you mean by function overloading? Their advantage, syntax with that program. With that, you have one more concept, friend function. What do you mean by friend function? Their features, syntax, as well as inline function. Inline function. 3 concepts you will study on this chapter. That is function overloading, friend function, inline function. In all the 3 cases, you have to study the syntax, the definition, their features, as well as one program on each concept. Whereas the next one, 9th chapter, that is constructor and destructor. Whereas on this totally weightage is 8 marks. Out of 8 marks, in part A 1 question, part B 1 question, as well as in part D 1 question. Totally 8 marks weightage in the annual exam. Whereas on this chapter also, you will come to know what do you mean by constructor, which are the different types of constructor, how to initialize a constructor, what are the rules to write a constructor, types, under types, default constructor, parameterized constructor, copy constructor, how to use a destructor, everything you will come to know in this chapter. Whereas the next chapter is inheritance. The total weightage of this chapter in the annual exam is 8 marks. Out of 8 marks, in part C 1 question, as well as in part D 1 question. Totally 8 marks you will get from this chapter. Whereas in this chapter also, you will study regarding what do you mean by inheritance, different types of inheritance like single level, multi-level, multiple, hierarchical, hybrid inheritance, then how it will work in visibility mode, the types of inheritance, as well as program you will study on this chapter, inheritance chapter. Whereas the next chapter is pointer. In this pointer, the total weightage is 6 marks in the annual exam. Out of 6 marks, in part A 1 question, part B 1 question, as well as in part C 1 question. Totally 6 marks in the annual exam. Whereas on this chapter also, you will come to know what do you mean by pointers, which are the operations in pointers we can able to perform, how exactly it will work, as well as you have one program also in this chapter. The 12th chapter is data file handling. The total weightage of this chapter is only 5 marks, but in part B, one question, as well as in part C, one question they will ask in the annual exam. Whereas in this chapter also you will come to know what do you mean by data, how to open the file, how to access the data, which are the different types of file modes. Regarding that, you will come to know. Whereas the 13th chapter is database concept. Up to data file handling, it's a practical oriented concept. Whereas when you come on database concept, it's entirely theory oriented concept. Whereas here, the total weightage is 14 marks in the annual exam. There are 2 questions in part A, 1 question in part B, as well as 2 questions in part D. Database concept. Whereas on this chapter, you will come to know what do you mean by data, what do you mean by information, what do you mean by data processing, the stages of data processing, the cycle for data processing, then how to perform the file organization like serial file organization, sequential file organization, direct file organization. All those things you will study on this chapter. The next chapter is SQL Commands, that is Structured Query Language Commands. The total weightage is 13 marks in the annual exam. Out of 13 marks, in part C, 1 question, as well as in part D, they will ask 2 questions. That is part D, 5 marks each question. Then here 10 marks as well as here 1 marks. Whereas on this chapter, you will study regarding the commands, SQL commands, that is structured query language commands like DDL commands, DML commands, DQL, like that. All those commands you will study how to create the table, how to access that, how to insert the records in the table. All those things you will study on this structured query language chapter. Whereas the next one, networking concept. This is the 15th chapter. Here, the total weightage is 9 marks in the annual exam. Out of 9 marks, 1 marks 1 question, 3 marks 1 question, as well as 5 marks 1 question. Totally 9 marks weightage on this chapter. Whereas on this chapter also, you will come to know that what do you mean by networking, which are the different types of networking like LAN, WAN, MAN, how data are transferring from one place to another place, which are the different types of file modes. All those things you will study on this chapter. Whereas the 16th chapter is Internet and Open Source Concept. The total weightage of this chapter is 6 marks in the annual exam. That is in part A 1 question, part B 1 question, as well as in part C 1 question. Totally 6 marks. Whereas on this chapter, you will come to know how to launch your program. For example, in first PUC, you have typed the program, HTML program. That program will work only on your system. If you want to make that system has to be that program, especially that program has to work on the internet, then you have to launch that program. That launching, how to launch the program, that we'll study on this Internet and Open Source Concept chapter. That is how to launch the program, whether it's a free version or it is a paid version, which type we have to launch, which are the methods to launch. All those things you will study on this chapter. Whereas the 7th, last chapter, that is web designing. The total weightage of this chapter is 6 marks in the annual exam. Out of 6 marks, in part A 1 question, part B 1 question, as well as in part C 1 question. Totally 6 marks weightage. Whereas on this chapter, you will study regarding how to create a HTML program. That is web page, how to create a web page. Whereas in first PUC, you have studied only the basic tags like bold, italic, underline, how to insert the border, like that you have studied. Whereas in second PUC, you will study how to create a table, how to create the table, how to give borders for the table, different styles for the table, as well as forms also you will study on this chapter. Whereas this forms helps to insert the value on your output screen. Whereas if you create tables or any other program without using forms, on that case, in the output screen, we cannot able to edit any values. Whereas in forms, helps to edit the value in the output screen also. These are the few chapters you will study on your second PUC. Now, we will discuss about the practical session. Already I told you, in theory, they will ask 70 marks. You have questions On theory, only 70 marks and 30 marks for your practicals. Out of 30 marks, you have totally have 16 C++ program, 4 SQL programs as well as 2 HTML programs. Whereas here they will ask the question in such a way that compulsory you will get a question from C++ in the practicals. With that, you may going to get HTML program. Like this pattern you will get. Otherwise, C++ with SQL. 2 pattern you may going to get the question. One pattern C++ with HTML or C++ with SQL. Totally here, if for practicals you have 30 marks. Theory you will write only for 70 marks. Whereas here, first program writing 6 marks, second program writing 6 marks. That means for procedure writing 6 marks each, and execution carries 8 marks, as well as Viva carries 4 marks, as well as your record carries 6 marks. Totally 30 marks the practicals will be considered. 16 C++ programs, 4 SQL programs, as well as 2 HTML programs. This is a lab pattern. But when they come on theory pattern, there totally you have 4 parts. In first part, you have totally 15 questions in part A, but you have to answer only 10 questions. Each question carries 1 mark. In part B also, you have extra 5 choice. Each question carries 2 marks. Whereas in part A, 1 marks for each question. In part B, 2 marks for each question. In part C, 3 marks for each question. But in part D, 5 marks for each question. In part A, you have to answer 10 questions. In part B, you have to answer 5 questions. In part C, also you have to answer 5 questions. But in part D, you have to answer 7 questions. Each question carries 5 marks, totally 35 marks. Here, totally you will write the theory 70 marks for theory and 30 marks for your practicals. Whereas in practicals, first experiment writing carries 6 marks for first experiment. Second experiment, procedure writing carries 6 marks. Your proper execution carries 8 marks. And your record carries 6 marks. And for your Viva, 4 marks. Totally 30 marks you have for practicals, 70 marks for your theory. Now is it clear for all of you? Thank you.